The Bronx is named after a Swedish farmer. In 1639, Jonas Bronk bought land north of Manhattan from the Lenape people, and the Bronx land became a borough. He was early, but not alone. Between 1850 and 1930, over 1 million Swedes followed. 1 in 7 people in the country left for America. Today, 4 million Americans carry Swedish ancestry, most of them in the Midwest. Sweden shaped more of American life than most people realize. Sweden is long and thin, about the size of California, but stretched vertically instead of hugged against a coast. The country runs roughly 1,000 miles from north to south. That is around 1,600 kilometers. Mountains form the western border with Norway. The east opens onto the Baltic Sea. In between lies a landscape of forests, lakes, and farmland that thins out the further north you travel. Forests cover nearly 70% of the country. These are not decorative woodlands. They are vast, dense, and commercially valuable. Timber and paper have been major industries for centuries. The forests also shaped Swedish character, creating a culture comfortable with solitude and space in ways that more crowded countries never developed. The climate splits the country in two. The south stays mild enough to farm, with winters that feel like Minnesota. The north crosses into the Arctic Circle, where the sun disappears entirely for weeks in winter and never sets in summer. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is geography that shaped where people could actually live. The Gulf Stream keeps Sweden warmer than its latitude would suggest. Stockholm sits at roughly the same latitude as southern Alaska, yet its winters are far milder. Without that ocean current, much of the country would be uninhabitable. Most Swedes cluster in the southern third. Stockholm sits on the eastern coast, built across 14 islands where Lake Mälaren meets the Baltic Sea. The city's location made it a natural trading hub. Ships from the interior could meet ships from across the Baltic without either venturing too far from safety. About 2.3 million people live in the greater Stockholm area today. Gothenburg anchors the west coast, serving as the country's main port and gateway to the Atlantic. Malmö lies at the southern tip, so close to Denmark that a bridge now connects them. You can drive from Sweden to continental Europe in minutes. Northern Sweden is not empty wilderness. Cities like Umeå, Luleå, Sundsvall, and Kiruna anchor the region, each built around extraction industries that powered Swedish development. Iron ore from Kiruna helped industrialize the country in the 19th century and remains among Europe's largest sources today. The mining wealth funded railroads, factories, and eventually the welfare state. Northern rivers provided something equally valuable, hydropower that now supplies roughly 40% of Swedish electricity. Long before any of this, the Sami people made this land their home. They have lived here for thousands of years, maintaining a distinct culture, language, and reindeer herding way of life that predates the Swedish state by millennia. Even so, population density drops sharply as you move north. Vast stretches of forest and tundra separate these towns. Some northern municipalities have fewer than 1 person per square kilometre. The contrast with the crowded south is stark. Sweden shares the Scandinavian peninsula with Norway, separated by a mountain range that made crossing difficult for most of history. Finland lies across the Baltic to the east, once part of Sweden for over 600 years, now a separate nation. Denmark sits to the south, close enough that the two countries fought repeatedly over the centuries. The narrow straits between them were strategic choke points, controlling access to the Baltic. These relationships shaped Swedish identity. For a long time, Sweden was the dominant Nordic power, controlling Finland and parts of what is now Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states. That empire collapsed in the early 1700s after a devastating war with Russia. What remained was a country that turned inward, focused on its own development rather than conquest. Regional differences still exist inside the borders. The south, called Skåne, was Danish territory until the 1600s and still carries traces of that history in dialect and architecture. Residents of Skåne sometimes feel closer culturally to Denmark than to Sweden. The north developed its own identity around mining, forestry, and survival in harsh conditions. Stockholm sometimes feels like a separate world from either, urban, international, occasionally resented by the rest of the country as distant and elitist. Sweden's geography pushed people south. Its borders forced centuries of conflict with neighbours, and its climate limited agriculture to a narrow strip of usable land. Southern cities handle politics and trade, while the north supplies energy and raw materials. This split economy shaped how Sweden developed and still defines the country today. Geography like this does not stay empty. People arrived early, following the retreating ice at the end of the last glacial period. The first settlers came north around 12,000 years ago, as glaciers melted and the land became livable. They were hunter-gatherers, following reindeer herds and fishing the coastline. Stone tools found across the region tell us they spread quickly once the ice allowed it. These were not primitive wanderers. They developed sophisticated techniques for surviving in a demanding environment. By the Bronze Age, trade networks connected Scandinavia to the rest of Europe. Amber from the Baltic coast was valuable enough to travel south, exchanged for metals and goods that could not be produced locally. This was not an isolated wilderness. It was a peripheral but connected part of a larger world. Bronze weapons and jewelry found in Swedish graves show influences from as far away as the Mediterranean. The people who became the Vikings emerged from this foundation. Swedish Vikings were different from their Norwegian and Danish cousins. While Norwegians sailed west to Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, and Danes raided England and France, Swedish Vikings went east. They followed rivers deep into what is now Russia, reaching Constantinople and even Baghdad. These eastern Vikings were called Varangians. They established trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. Furs, amber, and slaves went south. Silver, silk, and spices came back. Arab merchants wrote about these tall, tattooed traders who arrived by river, describing their appearance, customs, and business practices in detail. The Varangians did not just trade, they settled. They founded fortified trading posts along the rivers, establishing bases at places like Novgorod and Kiev. Some historians believe the very name Russia comes from the Russ, a term used for these Scandinavian settlers. The connection is disputed, but the Scandinavian influence on early Russian history is well documented. The Varangian Guard became the elite bodyguard unit protecting Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. For centuries, Scandinavians traveled thousands of miles to serve in this prestigious force. They were prized for their loyalty. As foreigners with no local political ties, they could be trusted not to join palace conspiracies. Runic inscriptions in the Hagia Sophia, carved by bored guardsmen, survive to this day. Back home, the Viking Age gradually gave way to something more organized. Scattered chieftains consolidated into regional powers. Christianity arrived in the 11th century, bringing with it new forms of administration and record-keeping. The Old Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, faded from active worship, though traces of them survived in place names, weekday names, and folk traditions. Sweden began to take shape as a unified kingdom in the late 900s and early 1000s. The process was slow and contested. Different families competed for power. The boundaries between Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian territory remained fluid for centuries. Kings rose and fell with alarming frequency. Assassination and civil war were common. By the 11th century, Uppsala had become an important religious center, eventually gaining an archbishop in 1164. The church provided infrastructure that helped bind the kingdom together. Monasteries spread literacy and preserved knowledge. Dioceses created administrative units that could collect taxes and enforce laws. Christianity gave Swedish kings a framework for legitimacy that the old pagan system could not provide. The medieval period brought Sweden into closer contact with the rest of Europe. German merchants from the Hanseatic League established trading posts along the Baltic coast. Their influence was enormous, so much so that German became the language of commerce in many Swedish towns. Stockholm itself was largely a German-speaking city for much of the medieval period, with German merchants controlling much of its economy. This German influence came with a price. Foreign merchants dominated trade while Swedish nobles remained relatively poor and powerless. The tension between local elites and foreign commercial interests would shape Swedish politics for centuries. Resentment of German influence became a recurring theme in Swedish national consciousness. In 1397, something unusual happened. Sweden, Denmark, and Norway united under a single crown through the Kalmar Union. Queen Margaret of Denmark engineered this merger, creating a Scandinavian superstate that, on paper, should have dominated Northern Europe. The reality was messier. The union was plagued by internal conflicts from the start. Swedish nobles chafed under Danish-dominated rule. The arrangement consistently favoured Danish interests, and Swedish autonomy eroded over time. Rebellions broke out repeatedly. Swedish peasants sometimes rose alongside nobles against Danish authority. The union held together for over a century, but it was never stable or popular. The breaking point came in 1520. Danish King Christian II had finally crushed Swedish resistance and was crowned King of Sweden in Stockholm. To celebrate his victory and to eliminate future opposition, he invited the leading Swedish nobles to a banquet. Then he had them arrested. Over 3 days, more than 80 people were executed in the main square. Bishops, nobles, and prominent citizens were beheaded while crowds watched. The event became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. The massacre backfired completely. Instead of crushing Swedish resistance, it created martyrs and unified opposition. A young nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father had died in the bloodbath, fled to the remote province of Dalarna. There, he raised a peasant army and led a rebellion that swept the Danes out of Sweden. In 1523, Gustav Vasa was crowned king, and Sweden became independent. Gustav Vasa is considered the founder of modern Sweden. He did more than win independence. He transformed how the country was governed. He broke the power of the Catholic Church, seized its lands and wealth, and established a Lutheran state church that answered to the crown. He centralized administration, built a professional bureaucracy, and created the foundations of a modern state. The Reformation was not primarily about theology in Sweden. It was about power and money. Church properties represented enormous wealth, perhaps a quarter of all productive land in the kingdom. Gustav Vasa wanted that wealth under royal control. The shift to Protestantism happened quickly because the king demanded it, not because of popular religious fervour. Most Swedes accepted the change with little protest. Gustav Vasa also established a hereditary monarchy, ending the old elective system that had made Swedish kingship unstable. His descendants would rule Sweden for over a century, and the Vasa dynasty would transform the country from a poor backwater into a major European power. The Swedish Empire emerged in the 1600s, and its rise was dramatic. A country of barely 1 million people came to dominate the Baltic region and play a decisive role in European affairs. The architect of this transformation was King Gustavus Adolphus, who came to the throne in 1611 at age 17. Gustavus Adolphus was a military genius who revolutionized warfare. He created a professional standing army at a time when most countries relied on unreliable mercenaries. He developed new tactics that combined infantry, cavalry, and artillery in coordinated formations no one had seen before. His soldiers were better trained, better equipped, better paid, and more disciplined than their opponents. He introduced lighter, more mobile cannons that could keep pace with advancing troops. The test came during the 30 Years' War, one of the most destructive conflicts in European history. This war, fought mainly in German territory between 1618 and 1648, began as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants, but evolved into a general European power struggle. By 1630, the Protestant cause was losing badly. Catholic imperial forces had swept through Germany, and it looked like Protestantism might be crushed entirely. Sweden intervened. Gustavus Adolphus landed in Germany with a small but highly effective army. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, he destroyed the imperial forces that had seemed invincible. The victory changed the course of the war and established Sweden as a major military power. German Protestants called him the Lion of the North and celebrated him as a savior. Gustavus Adolphus did not live to see the war's end. He was killed in battle at Lutzen in 1632, leading a cavalry charge into the fog. His body, stripped of valuables by scavengers, was found the next day. But his army fought on under capable commanders, and when the Peace of Westphalia ended the war in 1648, Sweden emerged with vast territorial gains. The country now controlled much of the Baltic coastline, parts of northern Germany, all of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and pieces of what is now Poland. This was the Swedish Empire at its height. A nation with a population smaller than modern Houston controlled territory that stretched from the Arctic to the German heartland. Swedish armies were feared across Europe. Swedish diplomats sat at every major negotiation. For a brief moment, this cold, sparsely populated kingdom at the edge of the continent was one of the great powers. The empire required constant war to sustain itself. Sweden extracted resources from its conquered territories, grain from the Baltic provinces, tolls from the busy ports, soldiers from loyal Finland. But the system was fragile. Sweden did not have the population base to hold such vast territories indefinitely. Every war drained manpower that could not easily be replaced. The country was overextended, and its rivals knew it. The end came with Charles XII, one of history's most fascinating and tragic figures. He became king in 1697 at age 15, inheriting an empire that was already showing cracks. Almost immediately, a coalition of Denmark, Poland, and Russia attacked, hoping to dismember Swedish territory, while the young king was too inexperienced to respond. They underestimated him badly. Charles XII proved to be a military prodigy with an appetite for risk that bordered on recklessness. He knocked Denmark out of the war within weeks through a daring amphibious assault. Then he turned east and crushed a Russian army 5 times the size of his own at the Battle of Narva in 1700. He spent the next several years chasing the Polish king across Eastern Europe, winning battle after battle through speed, aggression, and tactical brilliance. But Charles XII made a fatal mistake. Instead of consolidating his gains, he decided to invade Russia and forced Tsar Peter the Great to surrender permanently. In 1708, he marched his army deep into Russian territory. The Russians retreated, burning everything in their path: crops, villages, anything that might sustain the invaders. That winter was one of the coldest in recorded history. Swedish soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Horses died. Supplies ran out. The decisive battle came at Poltava in June 1709. The Swedish army, reduced by cold, disease, and hunger to a fraction of its former strength, faced a rebuilt Russian force. Charles XII himself had been wounded days earlier and had to be carried on a stretcher. The result was catastrophic. The Swedish army was annihilated. Charles XII fled to the Ottoman Empire, where he spent 5 years trying to convince the Turks to help him continue the war. He eventually returned to Scandinavia, but the empire was already lost. The coalition powers had seized Swedish territories across the Baltic. Charles XII was killed in 1718 during a siege in Norway, shot through the head, possibly assassinated by his own officers, who were exhausted by endless war. He was 36 years old and had spent almost his entire adult life in combat. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 confirmed what everyone already knew. Sweden lost its Baltic territories to Russia, which now emerged as the dominant power in the region. The Swedish Empire was over. What remained was a medium-sized country that would never again be a great power. The 18th century brought a period of recovery and internal development. Sweden experimented with parliamentary government, limiting royal power in ways that were unusual for the time. The Riksdag, or parliament, gained significant authority. Political factions competed for influence. For a time, Sweden was one of the more democratic states in Europe, at least among the propertied classes. The country produced remarkable scientists and thinkers during this period. Carl Linnaeus developed the system we still use to classify living things. The binomial nomenclature that gives every species a two-part Latin name. Anders Celsius created his temperature scale, originally with 0 as the boiling point and 100 as freezing, later inverted to its current form. Emanuel Swedenborg wrote mystical works that influenced philosophers and poets for generations. But Sweden's strategic position remained precarious. Russia was now the dominant Baltic power, and Sweden could not challenge it. The country lost Finland in 1809 after yet another war with Russia, a territory Sweden had ruled for over 600 years, gone in a single campaign. The loss was devastating. Finland had provided soldiers, resources, and a buffer against Russian expansion. Its loss forced Sweden to accept a new reality. The country could no longer compete with the great powers through military force. A new strategy was needed. That strategy was neutrality. After a brief campaign in 1814 that forced Norway into a union with Sweden, the country never fought another war. This was not pacifism, it was pragmatism. Sweden recognized that it could not win a major conflict and chose to stay out of them entirely. The policy would hold for over 200 years. The 19th century brought different challenges. Sweden remained poor and agricultural, while other European countries industrialized. The population grew faster than the economy could support. Land was scarce, wages were low, and opportunities were limited. Younger sons inherited nothing. Farm laborers worked brutal hours for minimal pay. The rigid class system offered little hope of advancement. The result was mass emigration. Between 1850 and 1930, approximately 1.3 million Swedes left for America. This was roughly 1/7 of the entire population, a demographic catastrophe. Whole villages emptied out. Young people left and never returned. Churches held farewell services for emigrants they knew they would never see again. They went primarily to the upper Midwest. Minnesota became so heavily Swedish that by 1910, over 12% of the state's population was Swedish-born or had Swedish parents. Chicago was called the second largest Swedish city in the world. Swedish neighborhoods developed their own churches, newspapers, social clubs, and businesses. You could live your entire life in parts of Minnesota speaking only Swedish. The emigrants left because they were poor, because land was unavailable, because military conscription was hated, because crop failures brought hunger. America offered land that could be had for almost nothing under the Homestead Act, wages that seemed impossibly high, and freedom from the rigid class system that still dominated Swedish society. Letters home, often read aloud to entire villages, described opportunities that seemed almost miraculous. Not everyone thrived. Many struggled with the language, the loneliness of the prairie, the harsh winters that were somehow worse than what they had left behind. Some failed completely and returned in shame. But most stayed, and their descendants are still there. 4 million Americans who trace their roots to this long, cold country on the edge of Europe. The emigration eventually forced change in Sweden itself. The country could not keep losing its young people. Reforms came gradually: expanded voting rights, labor protections, land reform. By the early 20th century, Sweden was transforming from a rigid, hierarchical society into something more modern and egalitarian. The threat of losing your population to America turned out to be a powerful motivator for reform. The transformation accelerated after World War I. Sweden stayed neutral during that war, But the conflict disrupted trade and caused food shortages. Social tensions rose, labor strikes spread. The old order was clearly failing. In 1932, the Social Democrats came to power, and they would dominate Swedish politics for most of the next 80 years. Their leader, Per Albin Hansson, articulated a vision he called Folkhemmet, the people's home. The idea was simple but radical. Society should function like a good family, where no one is privileged or left behind, where everyone contributes and everyone is cared for. This was not communism. Private property remained protected. Businesses stayed in private hands. Roughly 90% of the Swedish economy remained privately owned. But the state took responsibility for ensuring that everyone had access to healthcare, education, housing, and a decent standard of living. Taxes rose dramatically to pay for these programs. In exchange, Swedish citizens received a level of social security that was unprecedented. A crucial moment came in 1938 with the Saltsjöbaden Agreement, a historic compromise between labor unions and employers. Instead of fighting each other, both sides agreed to cooperate, negotiate peacefully, and share the benefits of economic growth. This labor peace became a cornerstone of the Swedish model and helped explain why the country industrialized successfully without the violent confrontations that plagued other nations. The system worked remarkably well. Poverty, which had driven millions to emigrate, was virtually eliminated by the 1970s. Life expectancy rose. Infant mortality fell to among the lowest in the world. Education levels increased dramatically. By mid-century, Sweden had transformed from one of Europe's poorer countries to one of its wealthiest. The Swedish model became famous worldwide as proof that capitalism and social welfare could coexist. But this success story has a darker chapter that must be addressed: World War II. Sweden remained officially neutral during the war. This neutrality was real in some ways, and deeply compromised in others. The country was in an impossible position. By April 1940, Germany had occupied Denmark in a single day and conquered Norway in a 2-month campaign. Finland was aligned with Germany against the Soviet Union. Sweden was completely encircled by Axis powers or their allies. A nation of 6 million people had no realistic military option. The Swedish army could not have stopped a German invasion. The government made a calculation: survival required accommodation. The accommodations were substantial. Sweden sold iron ore to Germany throughout much of the war, roughly 10 million tons per year, representing about 40% of German iron imports. This ore was essential for German steel production and therefore for German weapons. Swedish ball bearings, critical components that Germany could not manufacture domestically in sufficient quantities, went to German factories. Swedish industry profited from German contracts. Most controversially, Sweden allowed German troops to transit through Swedish territory. Between 1940 and 1943, around 250,000 German soldiers passed through Sweden on trains, travelling between Germany and occupied Norway. The transit agreement was signed under threat of invasion, but it was still collaboration with the enemy. Winston Churchill was blunt about Swedish behaviour, accusing the country of ignoring the moral issues of the war and playing both sides for profit. Swedish historians have been equally harsh. One wrote simply that Sweden was not neutral, Sweden was weak. The policy began to shift in 1942 and 1943 as the war's outcome became less certain. Sweden started accepting refugees in larger numbers. The country provided sanctuary for Norwegians, Finns, Danes, and others fleeing Nazi occupation. Swedish officials began quietly sharing military intelligence with the Allies. The calculation was changing. The most dramatic moment came in October 1943, when the Nazis ordered the deportation of Danish Jews. Danish resistance fighters and ordinary citizens organized a massive rescue operation. Over 2 weeks, they smuggled nearly the entire Jewish population of Denmark, about 7,200 people, across the narrow strait to Sweden in fishing boats, kayaks, and anything else that would float. Sweden accepted them all and kept them safe for the remainder of the war. By late 1943, Sweden had cut off German troop transits. By 1944, iron ore exports to Germany had largely stopped. The shift was real, but it came late, and it came only when Germany's defeat seemed increasingly likely. Sweden's wartime record remains a subject of debate and some national shame. One Swedish figure from this period deserves special attention: Raoul Wallenberg. Wallenberg came from one of Sweden's wealthiest and most prominent families, sometimes called the Rockefellers of Scandinavia. His family controlled banks, industries, and vast enterprises. He studied architecture at the University of Michigan, graduating in 1935, and spoke fluent English with a slight American accent. He had no diplomatic experience and no particular background in humanitarian work. In July 1944, at age 32, Wallenberg was recruited by the American War Refugee Board for a desperate mission. He was sent to Budapest, Hungary, where the Nazi deportation of Jews was in full operation. By the time he arrived, 438,000 Hungarian Jews had already been sent to Auschwitz. Only about 200,000 remained, mostly in Budapest, and the deportations were continuing at a frantic pace. Wallenberg invented a document called the Schutzpass, a protective passport that looked official and impressive, but had no actual legal basis. It featured the Swedish coat of arms, official stamps, and formal language suggesting the bearer was under Swedish protection. He printed thousands of them and distributed them to Jews in Budapest. The documents had no real authority, but they looked authoritative enough to confuse Nazi bureaucrats. He established 32 buildings throughout Budapest as Swedish territory, flying the Swedish flag and housing thousands of people under theoretical Swedish protection. He bribed Hungarian officials, intimidated German officers, and exploited every loophole and ambiguity he could find. He worked 20-hour days, sleeping only 4 hours when he slept at all. He personally climbed onto deportation trains as they were about to leave, handing passes through the windows to people moments away from being sent to death camps. He followed death marches on foot, distributing food, medicine, and forged documents. He confronted Nazi officials directly, threatening them with war crimes prosecution after the war. In one extraordinary confrontation, Wallenberg had dinner with Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, and told him bluntly that the war was lost and that Eichmann would be held accountable for his crimes. Eichmann reportedly threatened to have Wallenberg killed. Wallenberg kept working. Near the end of the war, when a Nazi commander named August Schmidhuber was preparing to massacre the 70,000 Jews remaining in the Budapest ghetto, Wallenberg sent him a message. He told Schmidhuber that if the massacre proceeded, Wallenberg would personally ensure that he was hanged as a war criminal after the war ended. Schmidhuber backed down. The massacre never happened. How many lives did Wallenberg save? The popular figure is 100,000, but historians estimate the direct number was more likely 7,000 to 9,000 through his documents and safe houses. The indirect impact, through his example, his disruption of Nazi operations, and his role in preventing the final ghetto massacre, may have been much larger. We will never know exactly. Wallenberg's own fate was tragic. Soviet forces captured him in January 1945, apparently suspecting him of being an American spy because of his connections to the War Refugee Board. He disappeared into the Soviet prison system and was never seen again. The Soviets claimed he died of a heart attack in 1947, but reported sightings continued for decades. Prisoners claimed to have seen him in various camps well into the 1970s and 1980s. He was officially declared dead by Swedish authorities in 2016. The United States made Wallenberg an honorary citizen in 1981, only the second person after Winston Churchill to receive that honor. The bill was introduced by Congressman Tom Lantos, who was himself a Hungarian Jew saved by Wallenberg. The street outside the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington is named Raoul Wallenberg Place. After the war, Sweden resumed its trajectory of social development. The welfare state expanded dramatically during the 1950s and 1960s. The Swedish model became famous worldwide. High taxes, comprehensive social services, strong labor unions, and a commitment to equality that extended into every aspect of life. The government demolished overcrowded slums and built modern housing with indoor plumbing, still a novelty for many Swedes in the 1940s. A massive construction program called the miljonprogrammet built 1 million working-class apartments between 1965 and 1974. Healthcare became universal. Education through university became free. Parental leave became among the most generous in the world. The 1960s and 1970s brought Sweden to the forefront of social change internationally. The country became known for liberal attitudes towards sexuality, gender equality, and personal freedom. Sweden was the first country to ban corporal punishment of children in 1979. Parental leave policies encouraged fathers, not just mothers, to take time off for newborns. Women entered the workforce in numbers that other countries would not match for decades. The economy thrived on manufacturing and exports. Sweden built an export economy around engineering and design, producing companies like Volvo, Saab, and Ericsson that competed globally in cars, aircraft, and telecommunications. Volvo became synonymous with safety. One of their engineers invented the three-point seatbelt in 1959, and the company gave away the patent for free so other manufacturers would adopt it. That decision reflected something about Swedish corporate culture. Profit mattered, but so did social responsibility. IKEA took a different path entirely. Founded in 1943 by a 17-year-old named Ingvar Kamprad, it revolutionized furniture retail by combining Scandinavian design with flat-pack shipping and prices working families could afford. The company became a symbol of Swedish practicality, functional, democratic, slightly boring, and enormously successful. Sweden also exported talent, sometimes permanently. During the emigration era, the flow went to farms and factories. By the 1920s, it went to Hollywood. Swedish actors reached global cinema across generations, from Greta Garbo and Ingrid Bergman in early Hollywood to Max von Sydow, the Skarsgård family, and Alicia Vikander in modern film, creating a continuous Swedish presence in international entertainment. Garbo became one of the biggest stars of both silent and talking pictures. Bergman won 3 Academy Awards and starred in Casablanca. Both women brought something distinctly Scandinavian to American screens, a restraint and interiority that critics struggled to name, but audiences recognized instantly. The filmmaker Ingmar Bergman took the opposite approach. He stayed in Sweden and made the world come to him. His films explored faith, death, and human isolation in ways that defined art cinema for a generation. The Seventh Seal showed a knight playing chess with death. Wild Strawberries examined a life of regret. Max von Sydow, his frequent collaborator, carried that sensibility into Hollywood, appearing in everything from The Exorcist to Star Wars. The Skarsgård dynasty, Stellan and his sons Alexander and Bill, continued the tradition into the 21st century, while Alicia Vikander won an Oscar and became the new Lara Croft. Swedish faces kept appearing on screens worldwide. The welfare state produced something unexpected: pop music. By the 1970s, Sweden was prosperous, educated, and culturally confident. ABBA emerged from this environment, 4 musicians who combined American and British influences with Scandinavian craftsmanship, and won the Eurovision Song Contest in 1974. Waterloo, Dancing Queen, and Mamma Mia became global hits. The group sold over 300 million records, proving that pop music did not have to come from London or Los Angeles. ABBA was not a fluke. Sweden developed an entire industry around songwriting and production. Max Martin, a producer from Stockholm, wrote or co-wrote hits for Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys, Taylor Swift, and The Weeknd. Avicii became one of the world's most famous DJs before his tragic death at 28. By the 2010s, Sweden had become the world's third largest music exporter, behind only the United States and the United Kingdom. The country that once exported iron ore and emigrants now exported sounds. Swedish athletes found global audiences too, especially in sports that suited the climate. Swedish sports culture produced global icons like Bjorn Borg in tennis and hockey legends Henrik Lundqvist, Peter Forsberg, Niklas Lidström, and Mats Sundin, reinforcing the country's identity as a winter sport powerhouse. Borg won 5 consecutive Wimbledon titles in the late 1970s, his icy calm under pressure becoming a national archetype. The hockey players flooded the NHL and became stars. Lundqvist spent 15 seasons as the New York Rangers goalkeeper, earning the nickname King Henrik from fans who adopted him as their own. These athletes carried Swedish identity abroad in ways that diplomats never could. Zlatan Ibrahimovic took a different approach. The son of immigrants, he became Sweden's greatest football player while refusing to fit any mold. When a newspaper ranked him second among Swedish athletes, he responded, "Coming in second is like coming last. I am number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on that list." It was not very lagom. Swedes loved him anyway. Swedish engineering shaped everyday life through inventions that spread globally without anyone noticing their origin. The pacemaker, Tetra Pak packaging, the adjustable wrench, and the safety match, embedding Swedish design into global infrastructure. The 3-point seatbelt was just one example. The pacemaker that regulates heartbeats came from a Swedish engineer in 1958. Tetra Pak revolutionized how milk and juice are packaged and shipped. These were not glamorous breakthroughs. They were solutions to everyday problems, designed with the same functional mindset that shaped Swedish society. The pattern continued into the digital age. Spotify, founded in Stockholm in 2006, transformed how people consume music. Bluetooth technology, named after Harald Bluetooth, a Viking king who united Scandinavian tribes, connected devices worldwide. The Bluetooth logo is actually a combination of the king's runic initials. 1,000 years after the Vikings traded along Russian rivers, Swedish technology was still connecting distant points. Alfred Nobel represented an earlier, more ambivalent form of Swedish innovation. He invented dynamite in 1867 and became enormously wealthy from explosives manufacturing. When a newspaper accidentally published his obituary, calling him the Merchant of Death, Nobel was troubled enough to redirect his fortune. The Nobel Prizes he established have been awarded annually since 1901, making Stockholm the permanent center of global recognition for achievement in science, literature, and peace. But the Swedish model faced challenges as the decades passed. Immigration transformed Swedish society in ways that sparked intense debate. Sweden had been remarkably homogeneous for most of its history. The population was overwhelmingly ethnic Swedish, Lutheran, and culturally uniform. People looked alike, spoke alike, and shared common assumptions about how society should work. That began changing in the 1970s with labor migration from Yugoslavia, Turkey, and Greece. Workers came to fill jobs in Swedish factories and stayed. It accelerated dramatically during various refugee crises. Iranians fleeing revolution in the 1980s, Yugoslavs escaping civil war in the 1990s, Iraqis after the American invasion in the 2000s. Sweden also accepted roughly 45,000 Chileans fleeing the Pinochet dictatorship, creating the third largest Chilean community outside Chile. The 2015 European refugee crisis brought the issue to a head. In that single year, Sweden received 163,000 asylum applications, the highest number per capita in the European Union. The country of 10 million was accepting more refugees than countries many times its size. Most came from Syria Afghanistan, and Iraq, fleeing war and instability. The influx strained housing, schools, and social services that had been designed for a much smaller population. Integration proved difficult. Employment gaps persisted between native Swedes and immigrants. Segregated neighborhoods developed in the suburbs of major cities. Debates over multiculturalism versus assimilation divided Swedish society in ways that had been unimaginable a generation earlier. The political impact was significant. The Sweden Democrats, a right-wing party with roots in the nationalist movement, rose from the fringes to become one of the country's largest parties. They advocated strict limits on immigration and a return to a more traditional Swedish identity. Immigration restrictions tightened dramatically after 2015. The open-door policy that had defined Sweden's initial response to the crisis was reversed. Today, roughly 26% of Sweden's population has a foreign background, either born abroad or born in Sweden to two foreign-born parents. The largest groups come from Syria, Iraq, Finland, and Poland. Since 2022, Ukrainians fleeing the Russian invasion have become another major group. The country has changed fundamentally, and the debate over what Swedish identity means in a multicultural society continues with no resolution in sight. Religion has followed a different trajectory. Sweden was officially Lutheran for nearly 500 years, with the Church of Sweden serving as a state institution that recorded births, performed marriages, and buried the dead. That formal connection ended in 2000, when church and state officially separated. The country has become one of the most secular in the world. While about half the population still formally belongs to the Church of Sweden, actual religious practice is minimal. Only about 2% attend Sunday services regularly. For most Swedes, the church is a cultural institution for weddings, baptisms, and funerals, rather than a center of spiritual life. Christmas is celebrated enthusiastically, but as a cultural holiday rather than a religious one. Swedish culture emphasizes concepts that are difficult to translate, but essential to understand. Lagom means something like just the right amount. Not too much, not too little, but balanced and moderate. It reflects a national character that values consensus over confrontation, equality over hierarchy, and restraint over excess. Swedes are uncomfortable with bragging or standing out. Wealth is often hidden rather than displayed. Fika is the coffee break elevated to a social institution. Not just caffeine, but a pause to connect with colleagues, friends, or family, usually accompanied by a kanelbulle, the distinctive Swedish cinnamon bun. Fika is sacred. Interrupting someone's fika is considered rude. Swedes are among the world's heaviest coffee drinkers, and the ritual matters as much as the beverage. Allemansrätten, the right to roam, allows anyone to walk, camp, or pick berries and mushrooms on private land, as long as they do not disturb the owners or damage the property. You can pitch a tent in someone's forest for a night without asking permission. It reflects a belief that nature belongs to everyone, not just those who hold the deed. Swedish food reflects the country's geography and history. Meatballs with lingonberry jam became internationally famous through IKEA cafeterias, though Swedes note that the dish may have come from the Ottoman Empire. Charles XII supposedly brought the recipe back from his exile in Turkey. Gravlax, salmon cured with dill and sugar, appears at every celebration. Pickled herring comes in dozens of varieties. Crisp bread has been a staple for centuries. The most notorious Swedish food is surströmming, fermented herring with a smell so powerful that it is illegal to open cans in many apartment buildings. The fermentation produces gases that bulge the cans alarmingly. Most Swedes find it disgusting. A small minority considers it a delicacy. Opening a can has become a challenge video staple on the internet, with reactions ranging from gagging to vomiting. Sweden's famous neutrality, maintained for over 200 years, ended in 2024. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 shattered the assumptions that had underlain Swedish security policy. If Russia would invade one neighbor, it might invade others. Neutrality no longer seemed like protection, it seemed like vulnerability. Sweden applied for NATO membership shortly after the invasion. Finland, with its long border with Russia, applied the same day. The applications faced delays as Turkey and Hungary raised objections, but Sweden formally joined the alliance in March 2024. The decision was controversial domestically, but reflected a fundamental reassessment of Sweden's security situation. The world had changed, and Sweden changed with it. Today, Sweden is a country of about 10.6 million people, roughly the population of Michigan. It remains one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, with high living standards, excellent healthcare and education, and a robust social safety net funded by taxes that would seem confiscatory to Americans. The economy runs on manufacturing, technology, and services. Companies like Spotify, founded in Stockholm in 2006, show that Swedish innovation continues. The country uses the Swedish krona rather than the euro, having voted against adopting the common currency in a 2003 referendum. It functions as a constitutional monarchy, though King Carl XVI Gustaf has no political power. The role is purely ceremonial, consisting mainly of opening parliament, presenting Nobel Prizes, and representing Sweden at state occasions. Government operates through a parliamentary system, with multiple parties competing for seats in the Riksdag. Sweden has come a long way from the Viking raiders who sailed east to Constantinople and the impoverished farmers who fled to Minnesota. The transformation from peripheral, poor, and warlike to wealthy, peaceful, and socially advanced happened within just a few generations. 4 forces shaped this journey. Geography pushed settlements south and made the country defensible but limited in resources and arable land. Power rose and fell, from Viking expansion to Baltic Empire, to catastrophic defeat, to strategic neutrality, and now NATO membership. Economics evolved from subsistence farming through mass emigration to industrial prosperity and the modern welfare state. Culture shifted from warrior ethos to Lutheran conformity to secular individualism within a collective framework. The Swedish story is not simple triumphalism. The compromises of World War II, the challenges of integrating a diverse immigrant population, the strains on the welfare model, the debates over national identity, these are real and ongoing. The country faces the same challenges as other wealthy democracies, with no easy answers. But the basic achievement stands. A small country, in a harsh climate, at the edge of the continent, built one of the most successful societies in human history. It did so through pragmatism rather than ideology, through adaptation rather than rigidity, through a willingness to learn from mistakes and change course when necessary. If your ancestors came from the cold forests of Scandinavia, or if you have ever driven a Volvo, assembled furniture from IKEA, listened to ABBA, streamed music on Spotify, or benefited from a 3-point seatbelt, you have encountered Sweden's influence. It is a country that matters more than its size suggests, and now you know why.